Well, today I'm going to talk about my new toy, my new 4K camera from Sony, the Sony ZV-E10. I was in the market for a new 4K camera. I already have the Sony ZV-1. It's done extremely well for me, and I was thinking about buying another one of these. But then I looked at some of the features on the E10 and I decided, hey, it's always good to have something a little bit different. Now, there are some new things added to this. There are a lot of things that are the same between these two cameras. And there's a few things that they actually left out of this camera, a couple of which I think I might miss. But I think overall, in the balance, it'll probably come out in a positive way for me. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the 8 features that are new on this camera. And I'll do them in reverse order. So the number 8 is it has more points of focus on its sensor. Now that sort of makes sense because it's a larger sensor, almost twice as large in area than the ZV-1. I think it's a total of, the ZV-1 has 315 points of focus on the sensor, whereas this one has 425 points of focus on the sensor. So we're going to retain the high-end focus that the ZV-1 has. That's already helped me make a lot of great videos. Number 7 on the list is they've added a new button at the top. It actually has 3 positions to it, and that is camera mode for taking still pictures, video, and what they call S and Q, which is really the abbreviations for their slow motion, which you can then set up in the menus for exactly how slow you want that to be when that button is activated. I've always had some issues with the ZV-1 in terms of understanding, the differences when jumping from one mode to the next. It was much more difficult to identify when you're jumping on that one. So this one is very definitive in that remark. Number 6 on the list, this one actually has a headphone jack to it. So it not only has a microphone jack, but sort of like the much higher end Sony cameras, there is a headphone jack as well. So you can actually monitor what the camera is hearing from the microphone, which is a big plus when you're really trying to make something high end. Another big plus, when you turn the camera on, which I'll do right now, if I go into record mode on the camera, let me turn that on here, there is a red border that goes around on the LCD panel, in addition to the light that's in front, which is one of the features that remains. Number 4 on the list is actually one of the things I'm really looking forward to. Whenever I've used the ZV-1 outdoors on a sunny day, it's really, really hard to see that monitor. Well, this one has a feature to it that allows you to increase the intensity of the monitor itself. It's something called sunny setting. And it also has a couple of other settings related to that as well. But the sunny setting will make it brighter in the sunlight when you're running with 4K. The Sony ZV-1, when you put it in 4K, it actually reduces the intensity of that monitor so far down that it's almost hard to even see anything, especially if you're trying to look for some of the settings in the screen. Number 3 on the list is it has better video quality. Combination of the sensor, which I'll get to in a moment, but also it does what's called downsampling 4K from 6K. So it's actually doing the recording in 6K mode, not just 4, and then internally, with the internal processor, it grabs the average of it from the 6K and creates the 4K image, thereby really improving the overall quality of the picture. Number 2 on the list, this is the biggie. You can take the lens off and replace it. It comes with what they call a kit lens. If you push the little button on the front here and you turn it counterclockwise, this lens comes out. And then you can align the little dots. It has 2 little white dots, one on the lens and one on the camera. You align those white dots and you can put them back together again, turn it clockwise until it clicks and you're locked in. Then number 1 on the list in terms of the new features for this camera is the sensor size itself. This one has a 1-inch sensor, which is not really 1 inch, but that's what they refer to it as because of its equivalence. This one has what's called an APS-C. And I'll put up on the screen here a diagram showing the difference in the size. Now obviously the high-end cameras are doing what they call full frame, a full 35 millimeter diagonal measurement on the sensor. So these aren't that. These are, like I said, APS-C, and this is a 1 inch. But there's a big difference if you notice from that diagram. Well, those are the 8 things that are new with the E10 that the Sony ZV-1 didn't have. Now I'd like to mention the 10 things that are the same, or the 10 key things. There's a few other the menus and other stuff that's not that is significant. But there are a lot of significant things, and 10 of them in particular I'd like to mention. First of all, it has a full articulating screen, just like the ZV-1. So you can open it up and you can flip it completely around so you can see it from the other side. That's actually something very unique to only the most recent Sony cameras, believe it or not. Or unless you're talking about something like a cinema camera, which has capabilities like that. Number 9 is one of the things that is very, very handy with this camera, with the ZV-1 and now with this one. When you actually have an image on the screen, if you were to touch a certain part of the image, a particular item, it goes into tracking mode on that item, as long as you have the menu configured to allow it. And it will allow the focus to really center on that particular item. So there's a lot of things that are used to set up areas of focus and all other options to it, as you'll see when we get into the menus. But this sort of trumps all of that and allows you to really click in where you want the focus of the video to take place. The next thing is the zoom. They both have zooms. This one is listed as having a zoom 16 to 50. Well, it just turns out because of the type of lenses and the type of the size of the sensor, the Sony ZV-1 has a 24 to 70. Well, it turns out they're exactly equivalent because of the difference in the sensor size. You have multiple ways to zoom in and out with this one. You can zoom in and out with the little button on the front, just like the ZV-1 has. Or you could use the zoom that's built onto the lens. Pretty cool, huh? Number 7 on the list, it's one of the biggest pluses that I have, which, by the way, the camera I'm filming it right now does not even have that capability. Well, it does, but you can only get it if you go into 1080p mode. It won't work in 4K, and that's the ability to go beyond the 4K limit on video clips. Both of these cameras support that. Big plus for this line of cameras, for their price. Number 6 on the list is the product showcase. So when you actually have a product in front of the lens, it will automatically adjust for that product when you bring it up close to the screen. So for example, if you're looking at this right now and looking at me on the camera, well, you can see me in focus, but if I do this, it will focus that. And it's pretty rapid in terms of how it does that. So that's the product showcase. Number 5 on the list is, there's a couple of different names for it. A lot of people like to call it the bokeh mode. It's really the ability to defocus the background. It changes the settings on the camera electronically, and it will cause the widest open aperture or the lowest f-stop, and then adjust all the other settings so that the background becomes out of focus. It depends on the depth between you and the background or whatever else you're focusing on. I'm assuming it's you, but it does work fairly well in a lot of cases. Then number 4, I've already talked about, and that's the tally light. So when you turn the camera on, if I go into record mode, you see that little light there. And that little light is called a tally light, so it tells whoever the camera is focused at, and if you're doing a vlogging, it would be you, that it actually is recording at that moment. Number 3 on the list is the microphone. Microphone is very directional. However, it's primarily set up to be directional towards the front of the camera, which sort of makes sense. If you're doing vlogging, you would be in front of the camera. If you're taking a video of somebody else, they would be in front of the camera. And this mic does a fairly good job of picking up the sound. Isolating the background, well, on the sides it can, but if there's something behind the object that's making some noisy interference, it wouldn't be able to block that out. Then number 2 on the list, something that I really don't use, but I gave it a number 2 because a lot of people do use it, and that's called the beautification mode, where you can actually have it electronically smooth out things, imperfections on your face. And then number 1 on the list, which they both have, but the ZV-1 actually beats it out a little bit in terms of its different options related to it, and that's the slow motion mode. This one can go 60 or 120 frames per second slow motion. This one has more than that. It has a 240, a 480, and I believe also a 960, although really the 480 and the 960 are really hard to use. You don't catch that much unless you really plan it out, but it is available to it. So that covers the 10 things that are the same between these two cameras. Now I'd like to mention 5 things, though, that were left out of this camera or made somewhat lesser than they were in the ZV-1. And the first one, number 5, is just that I just finished mentioning as some of the things that stayed the same. You don't have the 240, the 480, or the 960 frames per second in slow motion. Number 4 in the list, there's no built-in ND filter, and that's a result of having this detachable lens. This one, it's able to do it because the lens is built onto the camera, so they're able to do that with much less effort and much less cost. This one doesn't have that. You'd have to buy a separate ND filter that could screw onto the outside, which, by the way, you just get a 40.5 millimeter filter set, and you're covered for that. You should probably have a filter on this all the time anyway, the UV filter. That'll protect the lens in addition to cut out some unwanted UV effects. Number 3 on the list, this one doesn't have an automatic lens cover to it, the way the ZV-1 did. On the ZV-1, it automatically covers up and protects the lens when you turn it off, or you close the screen, which turns it off. The E10 doesn't have that, so you have to be much more careful in how you handle the lens itself in terms of accidentally touching it or things like that. Now we're getting into a couple of important ones that are real criticisms of this camera. Number 2 on the list is what they call a rolling shutter. Now I mentioned it and showed you that the sensor is larger on this camera. That allows you to go better with low light. Absolutely, and we'll test that. However, the ZV-1 has a multi-layered sensor. So when you do shifting or panning across the screen, you'll actually see choppiness take place in that panning, depending on the speed at which you pan, obviously. That's called a rolling shutter effect. And that degrades video, primarily video, where you're actually moving from left to right or right to left. And then the biggest thing that's deficient on this camera versus comparison, as we'll see later, to the ZV-1, is stabilization. It wasn't that good on the ZV-1 either, but from what I've heard, and I haven't tested it yet, it actually does better on the ZV-1 than it does on the E10. So we'll see how that goes. But that's a biggie, because the stabilization, this is meant to be a run and gun type camera where you take it and start filming along the way, and all that movement is going to be jittery. Unless you decide to go ahead and get yourself a gimbal type stabilizer, external stabilizer that you put the camera on, a special grip, a lot of them come with. But those things are going to cost you a couple $100 to get a good one. And I will be doing that in a future video. When I get one of those, I'll be showing how it works. Okay, with the introduction of this ZV-E10, I'm now going to go through the different menu choices that I have. Now these are the menu choices that I've made for PE for Doers in terms of the videos that I make for my channel. I'm not going to go through some of the ones that have defaulted, for example. I'll only go through the ones that I've changed. And I'll give comment on a few of them that I think there are options because I switch back and forth. So let's take a look at the menu. When you first turn the camera on, you're greeted by the initial setup, including the language that you want to select. Hit the center button here on the right to select, in my case, English. Then it wants to know your date, time, and area. Enter. It's already identified the proper area here. New York, Bogota. That's the Eastern time zone here in the US. So I'll just go ahead and hit enter on that. But now I have to set the date and time. It's set for January 1st, 2021. So this is actually November 12th, 2021. And time 2:13 p.m. Well, it looks like I have to go completely around to get to PM. Yep. 2:13 p.m. The date format, English, is fine. So now I come down to the enter. It's telling me where I can get the Imaging Edge software from. I'll say okay to that. And there we are, pointing at a clock on the wall right now. Zoom in a little bit. Okay, now let's go into the menu again. It's top button over here. And we'll start looking at some of the things that I set up. On this first page, really the only thing I change is the aspect ratio. By the way, anything with the little camera there implies that it's primarily for taking the still shots with the camera. But I do thumbnails, and so I want to have this particular one set properly. So I'm going to change it to 16.9. Go on to the next page. Nothing in this one, nothing in this one. On the fourth page out of 11, I'm going to change the focus mode. Well, right now it's already set properly by default. You want continuous AF. I don't want to pick any of the other options that are there, so I'm going to leave it on continuous autofocus. It by default has it set to zone, which is fine, but sometimes I may want to switch to wide depending on the situation. But for this purposes, I'll set to zone, and as you can see, it picks a zone that you can move around, or you can actually touch the screen to move it around as well. as long as you have the screen touch enabled, which we'll see in a little bit. Back into menu. The other thing on this that you might want to look at is the focus area limit. Now by default, you have only these choices checked, which is wide, zone. I like to also check center, and then I also like to go down to the bottom, which has to do with the tracking control. And I like to check wide and center for those as well. Come down to the OK, click OK. Then I want to come down to the face-eye autofocus set. I want to make sure that it has the face/eye priority and autofocus on, and that it's human. You can also change that to an animal if you'd like, but I'll leave it at human. Hit menu to back up, and that's it for the fourth page of the general camera settings. When you see that little first page, it generally applies primarily to the camera settings, although they're sort of mixed up. The second one primarily applies to video, but again, there's some that cross over. So now we want to go all the way over to page 9. Right now, soft skin effect is on. Well, by default, I don't want that. I'll change it in the function manual if I'd like to at some point, but right now I don't normally use that. So I'll click that and click off. Then I go to page 10 and 11, and there's nothing to change from my defaults. Now we jump into the second grouping of options. On this first page, there's quite a few things that I want to change. Right now, the shooting mode is set to intelligent auto. I really don't want that. I'm going to change it to my default, which is shutter priority. A lot of people that do YouTube love manual, and maybe someday I'll get to that as well, but I like to keep it with shutter priority, as I'll show you later on. Going back into menu, now it's shutter priority. This USB streaming, I will not click on it, because if I do, I'll have to break out of it. Well, let me try that. If I click into it, it's ready to be a USB camera. It's waiting for me to plug the USB cable into a computer. I can cancel that by going to the 3-mode switch set at the top, which has camera, video, S and Q, and I will click that to cancel it. That's what it says in that little message there. Confirms. We're now canceled. Go back into menu. File format. Right now it's set for HD. I like to use 4K, so I'm going to switch to that. XAVC 4K. And then the record setting is another one that you want to take a look at. There's a lot of options to this. I like to set it for 30p 100 meg. That's the size of the video, and thereby giving you, the extra detail and quality that you'd like to have, or at least that I'd like to have. The S and Q settings. What do you want it to default to when you hit S and Q button here at the top? Well, right now it's set for 30p 120 frames per second. That's exactly what I want. I could change it, but it's set to what I need. Hit menu to go up. On the second page, there's really nothing that I change. I take all the defaults on that. Notice anything with the little camera there, the video camera symbol, that means that those are options primarily for video operations. So they're all set the way I want. On page 3, however, I'd like to turn on the wind noise. Right now it's off. That gives me a little extra protection if I'm using the inboard mic that's on this. I don't use it that often, but when I do, I would like to have the extra break of the wind noise. I also put the little sound wind muff on it as well. Some people refer to it as a dead cat, but my wife doesn't like me to say that. And that really takes care, well, one more. Steady shot. Right now it's set for active. I do not like that. That's going to crop in tremendously. But I do like a little bit of it, and we'll talk more about the steady shot later, but let's set it to standard by default. There are other steady shot settings that only apply under certain conditions. So I don't have those conditions set up here. And that's really, if you have active, then it's not going to make any difference. That's it for the third page. Now we jump over. Nothing on the fourth page to change. Nothing on the fifth page to change. And then we get to the sixth page, and I like to change, or at least take a look at and evaluate the zoom range. Right now it's set to optical only, which means we'll only use the zoom built into the lens. Well, that's okay. You definitely don't want digital zoom. That'll use only the internal computer to zoom in and out, and the quality of the picture will suffer. But it's good to have the clear image zoom, and that'll give you a little bit of both. It'll go as far as the actual optical zoom is concerned, and then it'll switch over to the digital at the higher end. So just keep that in mind. The quality will go down at the higher end of the zoom because of that. But at least you have it available to you if you need to use it. On page 7, there's only one thing to consider, and sometimes I use it, sometimes I don't. It's the grid lines. I like the one that's called rule of thirds. If you've ever taken a photography lesson or class on the composition of a frame and picture, the rule of thirds is a nice thing to keep in mind as you position whatever is in the image that you want to focus on. Not just focus on, but highlight in the image. Well, by putting this on, you'll get a nice little 3x3 grid that has points to have you set up. It won't appear on the video, but it has you set up the image so that you're following very closely to the rule of third. I sometimes set that on, sometimes I don't. It varies on the situation. Now we'll go over to skip 8. There's nothing on 8. Good thing to look up the custom key one. There's one for regular pictures, one for video, and one for a custom key option, which is the play button down on the bottom here on the right hand side, that little play button. But I usually don't use that. So let's jump over to 9, page 9. And over here, this is very important, the top one. It's set correctly. We want touch tracking. A little disappointing with this camera that you can only touch for a certain couple of things that are available to it, but tracking is very, very handy. It allows you to save a lot of time when you're trying to get a particular object in the frame, in focus. I use it all the time. You can turn that off, or you can set it so that your touch focus instead. And touch focus is not as good as the tracking, because if the object is moving, it will not only keep it in focus, but it'll also track it along the way as best it can. And those are the things on 9 of 9. Now we move on over to this screen, Network 1. There's not a lot to look at here. One to consider though, if you ever have a need for it, is the airplane mode. If you click airplane mode, it's on or off, then you can actually prevent this thing from transmitting. So if you're on an airplane, that's why it has that name. That's good. But in some general conditions where you know you're not going to use the Wi-Fi or the Bluetooth, you could turn that on to save some battery power on this. The batteries on this particular camera are not very good. I'll talk about it later, but I actually have it wired right now with a fake dummy battery that's plugged in. And that's what I do when I'm using these cameras in the studio. Okay, now let's move on to Network 2. There really is nothing in Network 2 that I want to change. So we're going to end the network choices by going to the play. Now you can read about this, and there's some here if you really like to play back videos or look at pictures on the camera. There's a lot of power here. I don't use that often at all, very rarely, so I just left these all as a default, all 3 pages of it. So I'll skip that for now. Now we get up into setup, and the setup is an extremely important one for this camera. So what I suggest you do is where it says the very first one, monitor brightness, take a look at that. Right now it's set on manual. Click on that, you have your choice of something called sunny weather. If you're out on a sunny day, it's very hard to see this screen. It really is. Trust me on that. And the way the ZV-1 works, it actually goes into a lower brightness when you're running 4K, which is usually what I'm using. If you're doing just HD, it actually is brightness you can read. But I suggest if you're going to be outside, switch this one. I'm inside of a studio right now, so I don't need to do that. I will back up on that. You have other options here to play with this. You can adjust it manually, but I'm not going to play with that at this point. So let's go back up. The rest of this stuff on the first screen, a lot of it doesn't really change. Some people may want to take a look at their volume settings, because that will depend upon your microphone. The microphone that's connected to the microphone jack, well, it may have some issues, or it may be blowing you out in terms of constantly going too high. You could know that when you look at the grid as you're trying to set up in standby mode before you record, and you'll see the little scale on the bottom of the screen. So just keep that in mind. This is where you come to adjust it. Now the bottom one is another critical one. I suggest you go into that one. And I don't like the 1 minute power save start time. This camera will turn itself off after just 1 minute. So I like to change it to at least 2 minutes. You can go up from there, as you saw by this different options that are available to you. But that's not as important as the bottom one. And that is the auto power off based upon temperature. The camera tends to be very sensitive towards temperature in terms of automatically shutting itself off. This is what you do, just like with the ZV-1, set it for high power temp. It won't hurt anything. The camera will shut off before there's any sort of, even a hint at any damage, but it'll allow it to stay on longer. And that takes care of setup screen 1. On setup screen 2, well, here is where you have the touch operation. Make sure that that is on. That is absolutely critical to have that touch operation turned on, believe me. The other one that you want to take a look at here is the HDMI setting. Now, a lot of this is by choice. What do you want to do? I like to set it up for resolution fixed at 2160 1080p. So I'll go 4K very easily if I do that. And I use 4K as much as I can on the HDMI resolution. So I want to be able to have it function at that point. The other thing to look at, this one here that says the HDMI info display. I don't want the info display if I'm outputting through the HDMI, because I'm usually capturing that. So I turn that off. Now the info is all the little icons and other information that appears on the screen. Now if you're making a video about the camera, then you may want to take that and leave it so that it shows it. But other than that, there's really no reason to try to leave that option turned on. In setup 3, that first option, it's grayed out here. The reason it's grayed out, I don't have this camera plugged into a USB on a computer. If I did, you'd see that highlighted. And you could change it from mass storage to control, for example, to be able to control the camera through the HDMI. Or if you just want to generate power for the camera through that. and not have it open up an Explorer window so you can copy files from the camera directly. So that's something to consider with. Now the only other thing to consider on this page is if you messed up or you decide to change the initial configuration, or you just bought it from somebody who may have had it set differently. This is where you can redo those 3 questions in the very front: the language, the date, the time, and the area that you're located in. So this particular screen allows you to change that. On the screen 4, the top one is critical. That is where you can format the actual SD card that's inside the camera. If you click on that, it will warn you. You have to confirm that that's what you want to do, and then it'll go through a whole format option. And you should do this normally with your SD card, because they pick up a lot of trash as you delete and copy files to and from, and they become a little bit slower as a result. So I highly recommend that you reformat those cards every so often. Let's say you wanted to go back to what you actually had. You can actually come in here and say setting reset, and one of the choices is initialize. And if you do that, it'll completely initialize all the settings that we just changed or modified along the way back to the factory defaults. And that's it for the settings that I use on my ZV-1 and my ZV-E10 camera. Well, there's a lot to the menus on these Sony cameras. It's not just these, but all of the entire Sony line are that way. They did add a few interesting choices for the ZV-E10, as I noted as I went through them, but pretty much a lot of them are exactly the same. Now, if you want to learn more about these menu choices, I will put a link down to 2 things down in the notes of this video. One is to the Sony help page that goes through everything that the camera can do, and the other one is to a video that was created. It's about an hour and a half long though, not by me, but by somebody who made a really good video covering all of the options, including not just the ones for video, but the ones for photo as well. So go take a look. But now let's move on to some testing. I'm going to try it in daylight, and I'm going to try it, sort of low light at the end of the day. Let's see how they do. How does the stabilization look? That's the one that worries me the most between these two. I think that the ZV-1, which is on the right here, will actually beat out the one on the left, which is the E10. But let's see how it looks. I'll just walk around the block. The light's going to be changing. The sun will be around my backside in a moment. Let's see how these cameras handle that. Being very careful where I step with 2 cameras in my hands. How does it look? Making a turn. Now we got different lighting. How does it look? Going into the shadow now. Looks like it's a little more cropped on the E10. I don't have this thing zoomed in, do I? Nope, I do not. Just to make sure. They're set the same way. Going into the shadows. Now I've gotten reflections hitting my face. How do you look? Looking at the E10 right now, and now switching over to the ZV-1. Now this is in daylight. It's obviously late fall, and the sun is sort of hanging low these days. So we'll see how the different lighting conditions are handled by the default settings on these cameras. How does it look? Again, a bit more of a crop on the E10 than I see on the ZV-1. Put my arms out all the way. How does that look? Both arms are fully extended at this point. Coming around for another changing lighting. As I turn the corner here, I can see the stabilization is still much better on the ZV-1. That's why I'm getting myself a gimbal as soon as I can for that camera, if I'm going to be carrying it around. Coming up on the last turn here, going into deep shade. Here we come, turning right. Okay. Looks like the sun is coming up, but even if it doesn't, coming close to the end of this test. And then the next thing I'll try is in low light to see if there's any difference. Okay, I think that's good enough. Well, that daylight test is pretty interesting, don't you think? Obviously, the stabilization on this needs a lot of improvement, just as other people have noted. However, I was surprised to see, and I didn't have the defocus bokeh turned on, the natural bokeh from this lens, and I guess also a combination of the lens and the larger sensor, really came out well in that particular test in the daylight. It did much better than the ZV-1 in my opinion, because the background clearly was automatically defocused because of the lens quality. So that gives you more of a cinematic view of the videos that you create. That's nice. Let's do a quick low light test and see what we get though. Okay, here we are in a low light condition in a room with very little light. It's already pretty late in the day. Over on my left is my ZV-1 and over on my right is the ZV-E10. Do you notice any difference? Shift around a little bit. So that's a relatively low light condition. Let me go around this way. Does it make any difference? Okay, that's a quick test of low light. I know it's extremely low light, but I wanted to test it at the extreme. Maybe that was a little too low light. I'm not sure. But I didn't see much of a difference between these two cameras on that. Also, I've been switching back and forth in the sound between the ZV-1 and the E10, and I've noted it on the screen, as you may have noticed. There's really no difference in the sound because I'm using the same microphone. I was wondering if they would sound the same, but I guess it has the same engine, it has the same electronic interface, so that's something that I guess we should expect. Hopefully you got something out of this video. Talk to you next time.